Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 12 preview as we look ahead to, fortunately, and maybe a game week where we can get some serious points from our FPL players, or at least that's the hope. But in terms of this week, I do think it's reconsidering the swings of certain teams. It's looking at teams like Brighton, Arsenal, and even West Ham, teams that we mentioned 2 weeks ago that were good to jump on then, and obviously after an away fixture in Game Week 11, which was a little bit tougher, once again have fantastic home fixtures. Not only that, but I do think that there are new budget options that have crept up. And also, this is the time to reassess some of the options we've invested into. Myself, for example, with Tsimikas and Gabriel, and the doubts that are the sort of minutes that we can expect from such players in those positions. Now, if we look at, let's say, the defender position, I would like to actually start there. I do think, of course, this is a week, once again, where you can just reinvest into a Crystal Palace defender. If, let's say, you're sick of one of your defenders, you own someone like Udogi, you have someone who's red carded, or you have someone who's injured, it does make sense now to just simply jump onto a Crystal Palace defender if you haven't done so already. I myself will be considering that move. However, I do think in this position, there is also an opportunity to look at how deep your bench is, right? Because if, let's say, your only problem point is this game week, then maybe consider a Newcastle defender. I think we will watch the Champions League game and see how Newcastle will line up. But so far, Newcastle seem to have more faith in, let's say, Livramento as a right back and then Trippier being able to play left back than the opposite, where Lewis Hall will play left back in his default position and Trippier will play right back. So because of that, I think Livramento is definitely one option to consider, although I do think there's a lot of risk attached to that, just because you know that Lewis Hall could play at any time, even though we now know that Dan Burn is diagnosed to be out for 3 to 4 months. And as far as, let's say, another Newcastle defender, you've got Lascelles at 4.0, who of course has been relatively stand out for this Newcastle team. If anything, his defense has been fantastic as of late, and it'll be interesting to see, of course, when Botman comes back into the team. But I think our expectation is that he'll be back by Game Week 13 plus, so after the international break, and that obviously sets a very limited timeline for Lascelles to be useful on our teams. We know that Newcastle have great fixtures around Game Week 17, but one of the concerns with moving into someone like Lascelles is Botman is probably coming back to the team a lot sooner than, let's say, someone like Dan Burn is. So if you get the option right between, let's say, Lascelles and Livramento would probably be a better long-term pick than, let's say, Lascelles. So I think if you're picking Lascelles this week, you do have to acknowledge that you're probably buying into, you know, a fifth spot in your defensive lineup that is going to be a lot more weakened in a few weeks' time. However, if you don't want to do that, then I think there's obviously the chance where if you have money in the bank, you can actually simply invest into an Arsenal defender. And that Arsenal defender is probably going to be Saliba. Because now that we obviously saw the Gabriel benching in Game Week 10, you probably want to actually have an Arsenal player who's going to play even in the easy fixtures. Because it seems like now what might be the case is that Zinchenko, the more sort of ball-dominant player, is going to be playing in these easier fixtures like a Sheffield United at home, whereas maybe Gabriel has the chance to be benched for someone like Kiwior. So that is one of the concerns that I have in my mind. Now, Gabriel could still play in the Champions League game and also the Burnley game, and you could maybe consider that Sheffield United benching as, you know, an element of rest that was put into place for Gabriel. But I do think that it's a bit concerning that he was benched there. So I do think Saliba is the safest option, and I wouldn't really stretch my funds to go towards White. That 0.5 cost savings should be very helpful for you in the short term. If you don't really want to go for someone like an Arsenal defender because you maybe already have invested into Gabriel, then I do think there's also an opportunity here to maybe consider a Brighton defender. With Estupiñán, we actually have to wait for news on the press conference. So for the interim, I do think it's worth recommending someone like Dunk if you actually have some confidence. Now, with Brighton, one of the key things is that they don't really have great fixtures except for, let's say, Game Week 16 and 12 from a defensive point of view. So it's actually quite tough to own someone like a Dunk at 5.0 if you're not going to play him week to week. At the same time, I really feel like a lot of defenders have bad fixtures. If for example, you've invested into Tsimikas, he has a bad fixture in Game Week 13. If you've invested into some Arsenal players, once again, Game Week 13 is a bad week. Game Week 13 is a week that obviously suits Newcastle defenders instead, like Trippier, and also someone like a Crystal Palace defender. So I do think in the short term, the Crystal Palace defender is probably the best option to go with, and that's probably what I would stick towards this week. It's probably the safest play and the simplest play. Hey everyone, in the defender position, I also forgot to mention that, of course, Maguire, who I recommended last week, is still going to be a great transfer as well. If you really can't afford a 4.5, 4.6, let's say Crystal Palace defender, or you can't even stretch towards another Newcastle punt, and you don't really want to deal with Lascelles, I actually think Maguire is going to be a long-term pick that seemingly is nailed within this Man United team. Not nailed in the sense that, you know, he's going to be sitting in that team forever, but When it comes to the fact that Varane is almost permanently injured, Evans is of course quite aged, and of course Lindelof doesn't seem to be fully supported by the manager right now. I do think Maguire is quite a unique pick this week because, of course, the value that he'll bring to the table versus Luton Town at home is even better than, for example, a Newcastle defender. So do take that into account when you're making transfers this week. As far as, let's say, the midfield position this week, I do think it's a position where you can consider whether you want to go back into Saka. And part of that will be, once again, reconsidering, of course, Maddison's diagnosis. If you have Maddison on your team, and of course, that injury sort of precludes him from, let's say, game week 12, then it's a very, very simple, short move towards Saka this week. On the other hand, I don't really love going towards Odegaard or Martinelli. So I do think that this is an opportunity to actually consider whether you want to jump onto someone like Bruno Fernandes as well. However, I do think that's very risky, and I would only really do that if Maddison is 100% injured and we actually get confirmation from Angie that he will not be playing Game Week 13. Otherwise, of course, Bruno is sort of heading into pretty bad fixtures after, let's say, Luton Town at home, because of course, with our declining expectations of a team like United, they have Newcastle and then of course Chelsea in the distance, which obviously doesn't bode very, very well for them given their sort of standards so far. On the other hand, I do think this is simply a week where you can consider actually two options in the sort of budget midfield position. It's actually Eze and also Mitoma. Personally, I do think Bowen is a little bit too expensive. Now, of course, a lot of people will mention that he's been very, very consistent with points, and I don't really have a counter argument to that. Bowen has been fantastic, and of course, he got a very simple tap in from Akudu's sort of post miss shot in the previous fixture, and ultimately he's got a greater fixture now with Nottingham Forest at home. So this is of course a great week to go into Bowen, but I feel like the cost saving that you can actually get from someone like Mitoma at this point in time, or the cost saving that you can actually get from someone like Eze, if he is sort of declared to be fit by Roy Hodgson to start the fixture, then of course those are the two sort of priority transfers that I would actually look towards for this week in FPL, just because for the price point and for the overall good fixture run that Brighton and Crystal Palace have, I do think that you can actually sit with these two options for the short term. If we look back at, let's say, the two other midfielders that did exceptionally in the sort of budget positions this week, it's also players like Gordon and also another player in Palmer who we've recommended recently. What I'm concerned with Palmer is that I probably still wouldn't play him, and ultimately he has been very fortunate, right, to get 3 penalties so far this season. We've only played effectively 11 games of football, and Palmer has only been on Chelsea for much less than that. So I do think that Palmer has been very fortunate. It doesn't mean that Palmer's a bad pick whatsoever. I think Palmer is going to be an excessively good pick, and by the time Game Week 16 rolls around, we probably will all own Palmer. But does it make sense to jump onto Palmer just because he's done so well? I really don't think so, because I do think Chelsea's fixtures are tough. You're looking at City down the barrel, and it just makes sense to sort of avoid that sort of point chasing move there, in my opinion. Now, on the other hand, in the midfield position, I do think Gordon is starting off with a good fixture, but he similarly has another problem where after this great fixture with Bournemouth away, you're still looking at some pretty tough fixtures for Newcastle. So in my opinion, of course, if you're looking for a budget enabler and you're still trying to replace someone who's injured like a Neto, then of course I do think Gordon in the short term might be a bit better. But there's nothing to really say that Adingra has been a bad pick, right? Ultimately, his minutes have been very, very consistent, very solid for this Brighton team, and I'm not too worried about Adingra. So if you actually back the fixture, such as Sheffield United at home, then why not start with someone like Adingra, who has a cleaner run than Gordon and a cleaner run than Palmer? And then obviously you can actually use Palmer to be your sort of Adingra substitute much later on in Game Week 16. And that's going to line up quite well, even though technically Brighton have a good Game Week 16 fixture. So those are my thoughts in terms of the midfield position. I do think some of the other punts in the midfield position are a little bit tough to work with, and so I don't really think that there are any other midfield picks that I would really consider now. For example, Diaby I do think was more of a punt a few weeks ago. Aston Villa players are players that we'd probably be wanting to exit out of by Game Week 13. Now, as far as the forward position this week, I do think the punt is all about Nketiah. Once again, the Brazilian national team have actually seemingly called up Jesus for international duty, so it might be the case that he's actually going to be very back for this Arsenal team very, very quickly. And so that sort of mid-December timeline seems to be a little bit of a false estimate. And because of that, I do think that that sort of reduces the strength of the Nketiah punt. Going for someone who actually might only play around 80 minutes versus Burnley is probably not good enough for me in terms of how valuable our transfers are. Given that we've actually invested into some players that have very dicey minutes, like Tsimikas, like Gabriel, and even, for example, Dallo recently, then I do think that those picks are very tough to sort of work with. So that's one of the concerns that I actually have. As far as, let's say, the forward position, I do feel like, yes, of course, you can jump onto someone like Nketiah. But of course, the Brighton team has the better fixture. It's Sheffield United at home. So given the fact that Brighton are still a very, very competent offense, I do think maybe actually watching the Europa League match, trying to understand who plays the most minutes there, and then actually sort of reacting to that by simply going with the player who played the least minutes in Europa League could be a good little strategy here for a Brighton forward. Although I recognize that, of course, that's a very high punt strategy and high risk strategy. On the other hand, I do think it's simply a week where you can consider, let's say, holding Watkins, because this is the real strategy, right? Game week 12 is a perfect fixture for Watkins. It's Fulham at home. On the other hand, for Darwin, it's a good fixture, but it's still Brentford, which of course is a much better team than Fulham, and also, let's say, what City have in terms of Chelsea, respectively. So I do think that it's a holding pattern for the forward this week, particularly if you're holding onto a sort of expensive forward. And I probably wouldn't exercise a move unless you're looking for movements around the budget territory. If you do feel like you're in a luxury position, then of course Nketiah is an absolutely great punt. I also think that Awoniyi and Edouard are interesting picks, but still their minutes are still quite concerning. So for the meantime, I actually think that Dominic Calvert-Lewin is probably going to be the forward of choice for me this week if I was to suggest a player at that sort of price point, and you don't really want to deal with the gamble that is investing into a Brighton forward. As far as captaincy this week, I think the captaincy is also between 3 picks. Even with, let's say, Haaland confirmed to be back for the weekend, I would still probably exclude Haaland from my estimation. I think Chelsea have, for the most part, been a solid defense. I would be going towards the players who have great home fixtures. Salah, not necessarily a great home fixture, but because, of course, how good Salah is, I would always like to back Salah in a home game. However, of course, the competing options are going to be Saka and Fernandes. The way I would actually rate all of these picks right now is I'd probably actually go with Saka as my captain option. However, I think Saka is a close second. And then obviously, if you've got Bruno Fernandes, he probably will be the greatest differential captain this week, because I think he's got a mixture of, perfect fixture compared to, let's say, someone like Saka, where both Luton and Burnley, have put them on the sort of equivalent level based on how poor they have been on defense. But looking towards, of course, Saka, of course, you have to sort of say that penalties could be back to Odegaard if he's actually somehow back fit for the Burnley game. Whereas with Fernandes, of course, you've got 100% of that. Now, the concern, of course, I would say too, is actually Luton have been a relatively competent attacking team. So maybe when we're talking something as simple as clean sheets, probably more beneficial towards someone like Saka. And if you don't care about clean sheets, then I actually think maybe this is a chance to jump onto someone like Fernandes, who actually has better underlying stats than Saka, and go for a captaincy there if you don't have Salah for whatever reason. On the other hand, as I said, if you own Salah, it's probably the safest pick to go with. He also has a great fixture. He's at home. In the context, of course, how strong Liverpool is in Anfield, I don't think Brentford are a team to be slighted on at the very least. So that's going to be this. That's going to be it for the Game Week 12 preview this week. If you guys haven't liked or subscribed, do feel free to do so. And thank you guys so much for the members for supporting the channel financially. And I will see you guys in the next video.